Welcome to this event, which is launching the RUSI output from our research project on maximising the utility of the future of the UK's combat aviation. A particular welcome, as always, to our RUSI members who are joining us today. We hope that you've been enjoying the exclusive content we're providing for you recently, specifically in the analysis of the integrated review, the Defence Command Paper, and the UK's Defence and Security Industrial Strategy that we've put in the RUSI Defence Systems platform. Thank you for your continued support. Given that RUSI receives no core funding from the UK government or the Ministry of Defence, we rely on your support to keep producing the outputs we do. And so to this event. Since the arrival of air power on the battlefield, there's been an enduring tension in apportioning its use. Whether to support long-range bombing campaigns, often for claimed strategic effect, to interdict enemy aircraft, to conduct intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, and target acquisition, or to kinetically support troops engaged in fighting with close air support, there have never been enough aircraft to do it all. In mission terms, one would find it hard to contrast the use of strategic bombing campaigns in Vietnam with the weight of effort supplied to troops in contact during the height of the Afghanistan campaign. Between rotary and fixed wing, there have never been enough platforms to sate everyone's appetite. As aircraft platforms gained in sophistication, dedicated and specific airframes emerged and were allocated to each task. Different wars saw their use in different ways, with different priorities, and with different levels of success. Today, we turn full circle, with single platforms expected to do it all. But the arrival of even more sophisticated surface-to-air missile systems and air denial systems is making airspace over the front lines a rather challenging place for aircraft, particularly fast air, to operate. Couple that with reduced numbers of military platforms as they get more and more expensive, and one might wonder whether troops will ever see fast air in their direct support again. These are just some of the considerations that has driven the British Army to reorganise its attack and reconnaissance aviation into a single independent combat brigade. Rather than being deployed in support of other formation as units of action generated by Joint Helicopter Command, the Army will use its aviation in battle groups to conduct deep strikes. Concentrating one of the Army's most lethal platforms presents both the opportunity to bring fire onto the enemy and provides helicopters with a better chance to survive because they can plan their own missions. On the other hand, Britain's close combat units are likely to miss the firepower that has previously supported them and that they've become used to. Furthermore, concentrating aviation might add risk, and survivability will depend upon the robustness of the planning process, but also the judgment of its commander. Over the past year, the RUSI team has studied the first aviation brigades model to assess the advantages and disadvantages of it, the implications for the wider force, and how the British Army can maximise the effectiveness of the formation over time. The report also considers whether the Army should pursue spiral development of its aviation capabilities to ensure that the formation remains survivable and effective. Now listen, the report's authors should need little introduction to most of you. Jack Watling and Justin Bronk represent a core part of the intellectual horsepower of the RUSI Military Sciences team. Justin is the Research Fellow for Air Power and Technology and editor of RUSI Defence Systems. Jack is the Research Fellow for Land Power and an analyst of contemporary conflict that places him in high demand internationally. Each will speak for a short period and then we'll open for questions. Because of the restrictions in this platform, I'm going to have to pose your questions for you. Now, I know this is frustrating for you. It annoys you as much as it annoys me. We miss hearing your voices in person, of having the interaction of face-to-face challenge and meeting you in and around the event. We're working on trying to fix this and give greater opportunities for interaction. But right now, we're bound by this platform and the technology. Rest assured, we're working on it. But I digress. Send your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and I will try my best to get the speakers to answer as many of them as I can. We're going to take about 30 minutes, maybe 25 if we can cut them down to size, of formal remarks before we get into questions. But for now, over to Jack, then to Justin.
Thank you very much, Peter. This has been a really fun project for us to work on, because very often when we're looking at future capability, we're dealing with hypothetical capabilities or platforms. And the question is, what do you require? The integrated review has been vague on some of those questions, and a lot of the programs that it has been specific about are ones that are likely to deliver in the later part of the 2020s. However, the UK's combat aviation is in quite a unique position. We knew the platforms that were being acquired and modernized quite early on, before the IR came out, really. And they are essentially coming into service in the next couple of years, which means that we know what the platforms are, and the question is, how do we best use them? Now, looking at the history of combat aviation employment, one thing really stands out, as Peter mentioned, which is that the demand always outstrips the available number of helicopters. And aviation forces have historically been very, very flexible in how they meet that demand, reconfiguring themselves in conflict. Joint Helicopter Command, in many ways, embodies that attempt to be flexible and maximize the availability of support to the rest of the force, essentially pooling assets from across the services and being able to draw upon them as units of action to support multiple missions. In many ways, it was an ideal structure, I think, for what we came up against in Iraq and Afghanistan. And aviation proved highly effective, both in resupplying bases, but also, and supporting our troops in that sense in a logistical capacity, but also providing suppression of the enemy, allowing our ground forces to maneuver and conducting attack. The real challenge, I think, is that through 2019, I observed in a lot of war games that units in the British Army had become accustomed to thinking about aviation as something that supports them. And it was being played in war games as a card that could be used and would show up and deliver a very substantial amount of firepower from Apache against enemy forces in those exercises. But Justin and I were both looking at adversary capabilities, and it was very apparent to us that the use of aviation in that context of coming in to try and provide supports to units in contact was one that would place them under very, very substantial risk. And so the question that we were kind of trying to chase after was, how do you operate and how do you organize your aviation to be able to deal with the threat? We know what platforms we got. How do we make them function in that context where the threat is much increased? And the Army in many ways were ahead of us on this because they formed one aviation brigade shortly thereafter. Obviously, the acquisition of new platforms often gets a lot of kind of words written about it. In this case, it's the restructuring of the force. But actually, I think that's equally important because forming an independent brigade allows the brigade to go after essentially ensuring its survivability and therefore the persistence of its effect in the operating environment. So today's presentation is going to be kind of in two parts. The first question ultimately is, are helicopters survivable on the modern battlefield? And what do you need to do to make them survivable? Are they up to it in the threat environment? My colleague Justin Bronk is going to deal with that in some detail. I'm then going to talk about a concept of operations and the opportunity, what that gives to the British Army, and the implications of the advantages, but also how we need to resource it if we are going to turn that vision into a reality. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to Justin, and then I will come back after he's spoken. Over to you.
Thanks, Jack. So when we went out and had a fly and a good chat with the good folks over at One Aviation Brigade, one thing that they were very keen to stress up front is the sort of survivability onion approach that they take to any threat assessment when they're flying. Essentially, the relatively simple approach, but it guides all the way that they approach all operations. The first being at the first level is don't get detected. So ideally, if you can, you fly in bad weather or at night, you fly nape of the earth as close as you can to obstacles. You use whatever terrain you can, including down to, and we experienced this ourselves, flying literally hovering between trees, kind of peeking between them, using all the cover that the ground gives you to avoid being seen. The second level, if you're detected, is to avoid being hit. So clearly there's evasive maneuvers within that. There's also attempting to, again, put cover between yourself and them. Or indeed, if it's for example, a radar guided threat, something like guided AAA, anti-aircraft firepower, then try and kill that threat before it can engage you successfully. Once you're taking fire, then if you are hit, the next layer would be stay airborne, stay effective. So there's a level of redundancy that, for example, Apache in particular is built more than pretty much any helicopter currently flying to be able to take hits, lose significant portions of airframe or systems within without being rendered non-airworthy. But of course, there are limits to what you can do with that, and particularly if you're taking heavier caliber fire, any reasonable degree of exposure to hits from anti-aircraft fire, or let alone things that are bigger than that, are going to relatively quickly push you up into the next bracket, which is trying to crash well and prevent any threat to life of the crew. So there's this kind of layered survivability approach that they take. Now this applies, of course, whether you are looking at the counterinsurgency or indeed lower end grey zone operations or contingency threat scenario, where predominantly one is dealing with a mix of ground fire. So AAA being both traditional, unguided, usually 12.7/50 caliber, moving up to 23mm, which is very common in large parts of the Middle East, as well as ex-Soviet states, and up to higher caliber stuff as well in some cases. Some of that in the more sophisticated end is radar guided. That of course makes it more lethal in the sense that it can track you much better, and the fire control is better. But it also means that if those systems are scanning and trying to acquire, then they will show up on the radar warning receivers on the defensive aid system, and can either be evaded potentially electronically, degraded to some degree, or engaged directly. Whereas encounters with close range AAA, whether it be dedicated anti-aircraft artillery or just small arms fire, troops anywhere will tend to fire at any helicopter they can see. It's often a case of having to take evasive action once engaged, and so there's a combination of needing a level of redundancy in armoring critical components, but also very carefully planning your flight plans, and in this case, both whether it's contingency operations where perhaps you can fly a little bit higher because the threat from high-end SAMs and things isn't forcing you low, but certainly in any kind of peer conflict or warfighting context, one of the critical dependencies on surviving AAA, which also not only includes guns, but things like man-portable air defense systems, man-pads, and indeed anti-tank guided missiles and unguided anti-tank rockets. So for example, in Afghanistan and Iraq, there was a lot of use of RPGs against helicopters, including as airburst weapons fitted with a fuse to kind of push shrapnel out. That relies on very good up-to-date intelligence on enemy forces' threat disposition. So where they are, where they're likely to be encountered. Particularly, again, it's much safer if you can fly at night or in really bad weather, so that it's harder for those incidental threats that aviation might come across to spot them. They get less warning. It's harder for them to acquire a target visually as well as potentially optically. But of course, again, going back to what Jack said at the beginning, if the force is fixed by being kind of committed to providing detachments to support the deficits in anti-tank firepower in maneuver units on the ground, then there's much less flexibility to choose mission routings, timings. You may be fixed to operating during the day, because essentially the call will come through whenever the kind of the greatest level of threat is being experienced at the front line. So it allows the enemy to dictate the tempo, and a lot of that initial layer of the survivability onion of trying to not be seen and not detected and then not hit is much harder to ensure. At the higher level, of course, you're looking at radar-guided threats in particular, which start to become a major problem against any state adversary, near peers, as well as, of course, peer states like Russia in an Eastern European context. For a long time, Apache in particular, but Rotary in general, has relied on nape of the earth flight against more sophisticated adversaries. We saw this in the first Gulf War in particular. There were some deep strike operations which relied on very, very, very low level flight to kind of fly under the radar, quite literally. Modern systems, are better at kind of picking out things at the fringe of clutter for them. But of course, if anything is ground-based, it still has a relatively limited radar horizon. So aviation may be able to get relatively close, particularly if it's able to exploit undulating terrain or even things like forests. In Eastern Europe, it tends to get very flat. So looking at a NATO context, while you can leverage forests to a degree, they make it difficult for radars that aren't mounted on poles or higher ground, of which there isn't very much. But of course, they also limit somewhat the room for maneuver for low-level flight. But of course, against the state adversary, you also have to deal with look-down, shoot-down sensors. So this might be things like AWACS, so Russia's A50 or A100, which they're new generation AWACS, Chinese KJ-200, KJ-2000, and of course there's increasing proliferation around the world to what we would class as near-peer states looking to acquire a range of look-down, shoot-down capabilities, whether they be traditional big-wing ISR like AWACS or UAV-based solutions, which again give you that ability to look down, so the radar horizon is no longer giving aviation that level of protection. Russia in particular also has one very specific asset, which is its own, not just look down, shoot down in terms of target acquisition threat, but also has a stick, which is the MiG-31 behind me on the background. The MiG-31 BM in particular is optimized for detection and defeat of low-level threats, particularly cruise missiles. But because of the way its radar is set up, it's very, very high power. It's not hugely sophisticated, but it's designed for looking down within 4 ships and scanning a very large swathe of low-level airspace, and is equipped with either R-33s or the more modern R-37 long-range missiles. Assets like this, which I say like this, it's really a sort of standalone threat in terms of quite how well adapted it is potentially for attacking aviation in a peer conflict. Essentially reinforces one of the rationales for pushing for aviation to be planned and operated as its own organic brigade asset, because if you are going to operate in airspace that is potentially subject to threats like AWACS directed either post-Apex lock-on missiles from SAMs, or even things that can engage down like Red Air, in particular big threats like the MiG-31, then you're going to have to be able to plan your aviation operations very, very closely with offensive counter-air, with suppression of enemy air defenses activities. In other words, it's going to be a joint planning task that requires a dedicated staff that can plan and interact at the correct level with the sort of light blue fixed-wing Air Force recognized air picture and threat mitigation procedures that are going on as part of the broader campaign. It also requires a level of understanding and being able to be briefed and access the threat picture at a significant level of granularity and breadth to be able to make the call to say this is not a viable mission set in any particular case, so that the threat level is not able to be mitigated in this particular circumstance. Because again, as Jack said, if you're grouping together one of your most potentially lethal assets, it then also is no longer really viable as a defense to say, well, we're hoping that, let's say, the Russians in a NATO context won't dedicate too many of these big strategic assets like the MiG-31 or long-range SAMs to us because they'll have more important things to do. But of course, if you're becoming the major tank killing element of the British Army, you're going to become a serious threat and therefore accorded priority in terms of enemy threat systems above what detachments might be in shorter order. It's worth also remembering that a lot of modern SAM systems that used to be fairly short range that would accompany ground forces, so armored forces in particular, things like the latest generation of SA-15 Tor, so the M2, as well as some of the more mobile SA-17 type systems, are now reaching out to a level both in terms of radar performance, particularly if they can get a bit of higher ground, but also just their missile range is really pushing them far beyond what Apache can deal with in terms of its own standoff capabilities. So once again, you're at a point where aviation can be survivable. It can fall back on a lot of these capabilities and on the excellent defensive aid suites and the tactics that are there, but it will have to be able to pick and choose where it does so. It's going to have to be able to pick and choose where A, it doesn't meet the enemy where the enemy is A, expecting them, and B, arrayed in full force, so to speak. And it's also going to have to try and pick places where, for example, along unit boundaries or particularly useful bits of terrain where they can infill, get into position with minimal risk of being detected. So a very, very powerful hammer, but against a lot of these threats that you're looking at in the high-end context, one that must be managed very carefully. And with that, I will hand back to Jack.
Cheers, Justin. So I think Justin's outlined the threats and the fact that from our assessment, you can mitigate against them, but it requires the capacity to plan. And that planning cycle, on our estimation, takes around 72 hours for each operation. Now, you can plan multiple operations concurrently, so you can keep up a tempo of 2 sorties from each of your battle groups a night, realistically for about 3 days, and then you'll need to replenish. But within that tempo of operations, you still need that lead time to soak in the operating environment, use joint assets, pull in ISTAR from air assets like F-35 that might be in the area, and to fuse that to plan your routes for entry, and then your ability to get in against targets that have been identified. Now, if you can do that, then the firepower that an Apache battle group brings to bear is very formidable. The over 200 ATGMs is not implausible if you're fully stockpiled. And in that context, you are able to bring an overwhelming volume of firepower that increasingly is able to use active seeker heads to engage vehicles beyond line of sight. So long as you can get PID on them and you understand where they are, then if you can get the munitions into that area, you can have a very, very substantial effect. The challenge is that the tempo at which you need to operate to be able to deliver that effect is now disjointed from the rest of the force, because the rest of the force is being attacked often during the day when Apache will not necessarily want to get pushed in. But it's also that point of clash on the FLOT, the forward line of own troops, is exactly where most of the enemy sensors are going to be pointed, which means that conceptually we need to get back to going after deep targets. And one of the interesting things that is mentioned in the IR, but is consistent with a huge amount of operational analysis of recent conflicts, even some that have been fairly high intensity, is that we're seeing very substantial levels of mutual penetration of forces. That's true in Ukraine. It was true in Nagorno-Karabakh. It was true in Iraq, where essentially the lower force density, because of the increasing range of munitions, is meaning that actually you can work your way through the seams between unit boundaries. The Russians in their operational analysis also recognize this when they talk about a fragmented battlefield. They expect units to get into their flanks. But because of that, deep strikes can actually get in and start delivering levels of effect that mean that the close combat forces then are under much less pressure. So utilizing these forces more independently allows you to go after targets in the deep and then alleviate the pressure 24 hours, 48 hours hence on the front, because the forces that you've engaged now can't be pulled into contact. To do that, you need very substantial levels of ISR, and there are a couple of other things that you need. So the first thing I think is that you need essentially mission guidance. One of the challenges that we have is that we've become very used to talking back and forth between units and communicating, having our radar on, and therefore having very substantial real-time situational awareness. Increasingly, something like Apache, it will be able to get its brief, it will be able to cross the FLOT, and it will be wanting to turn its radar off as much as possible, as well as not transmitting its location or making requests to its headquarters over link and other systems, because to do so would flag its presence to the enemy and therefore allow them to adjust. As a result, you can still receive data and updates, and therefore, whereas historically we've seen the use of reconnaissance aviation like Wildcat as something that is working very close and intimate support of attack aviation to find targets, increasingly you want the ISTAR to be standoff, but to be able to provide a persistent laydown of the battlefield and updates. And this is where I think there are some relatively small gains in acquisitions as we look at spiral development and improvement of the force that can transform one aviation brigade into something that's very, very lethal. Wildcat being central to that. So if you put the sea spray radar on Wildcat and have it hold off above the brigade support area of 3rd Division, you have about 150 kilometers range where you are able to do GMTI tracking against, you won't be able to track everything in that area because there are too many returns. But in the area of focus that the brigade is Apaches are trying to maneuver into, you can track which enemy forces are moving, whether they're converging on the position. And through something like Link, you can push that data to the Apaches so that they have ready situational awareness. And therefore, upgrading Wildcat as a mission controller or as a data transmission point with Link and with sea spray radar is a fairly cheap and very obvious win, I think, for significantly increasing the capability. It also provides an opportunity for doing experimentation with attack reconnaissance teaming and new ways of doing that. The other area where I think we need to look quite carefully is that there have been some detailed studies in the US that demonstrate that when you're doing reconnaissance, you really want eyes on. You want a human in the loop. Now, we know that RF control or standoff control of UAVs except for massive strategic level UAVs that are, very high altitude and scarce, expensive assets, is going to be very difficult to maintain in future conflict because of the level of EW that's in place, which means that you're increasingly talking about autonomous UAVs. And if we're talking about autonomous UAVs, they may be very, very effective for surveillance because they can gather data and then burst transmit it when they can get access to bands within the spectrum. They are less likely to provide continuous eyes on so that you have a reconnaissance capability and understand the environment. Human operators in helicopters are better able to do that. And so working them forward is very, very valuable. Having them in those recce platforms is very valuable for the wider force. But using UAVs, teaming with them, allows you to significantly increase the effect they can have. So for example, if you are able to launch a munition off an Apache that is able to work its way in to either jam a sensor so that you can get past it, or potentially give you a positive identification of the target without exposing the Apache to an enemy system so that you can launch a large number of munitions without having line of sight, that suddenly increases your protection, reduces the enemy's opportunity for attriting the force, and allows you to have a very substantial effect. And in war games, when these kind of capabilities are used, the effect is disproportionate. We're talking about easily upwards of 30% of the enemy force being attrited by this one capability within the British force. So the opportunity is significant, but it does need continuing investment, and it does need that use of experimentation to see how we can maintain its relevance in the operating environment. There are some quite specific vulnerabilities that I think will need to be developed. The first is that if this is going to be an independent brigade, and it is going to be working on a separate tempo to the other brigades in the division, then it needs its own logistics battalion in its orbit. That is essentially because it will have demands on spares and munitions in particular that other units will not. And because it is more likely to be located further back in the core support area, it will therefore be drawing on essentially those assets via a different route to the rest of the divisional logs. And in that context, therefore, it likely needs its own logs battalion, as any other independent maneuver brigade would have. It also requires a change in mindset in terms of how other parts of the force think about the threat, because they are not going to have that responsive support that they've been used to. The third thing is I think we're going to need to procure an increase in fuel bowsers. There are a couple of pinch points in the system that at the moment are very scarce and therefore become high priority targets for enemy special reconnaissance action and this kind of thing. And the final one is munition stockpiles. It's all very well having the concept of having these highly deployable battle groups with a lot of lethality. And I should flag, they're relevant in competition as well as conflict. If we had had the permission from the Iraqis to put them in Erbil, for example, in 2014, 2015, a battle group of Apache could have had, and Wildcat could have had a very, very substantial effect on slowing down and inflicting casualties on Islamic State, for example. But in either case, you need the munitions to back it up. And at the moment, that is an area because headlines about platform numbers are, get higher traction than headlines about munition stocks. At the moment, those munition stocks are very low. There are some easy wins that we could have in terms of certifying Hellfire for as long as we continue to use it before we replace it with something else. Essentially having longer hours that we're allowed to fly with it, because at the moment we have the shortage certified flight hours for that munition in NATO, I think, and it doesn't need to be that short. And already, therefore, you start increasing the number of munitions that you can store and hold on airframes. So long as that investment, which is relatively small, is in place, then the capability is really significant. But the wider point is that in order to be able to maximize the utility of aviation in the future, we're going to need to change our mindset of how we employ it across the joint force. It's no longer supporting, it's conducting independent operations, and you'll feel the benefit a couple of days hence when those enemy maneuver forces that have been attrited don't show up on the front line to attack you. The final point I would make is that there hasn't been an emphasis in this presentation on air assault. And there's a reason for that. I think air assault is absolutely a viable tactic, but the contexts in which it can be used are increasingly limited, especially in a high threat scenario. And the real killer for air assault operations is not insertion, because the same tactics that allow Apache to work forward can function to allow Chinook to get forward and deploy troops. The real killer is that if you deploy a large number of troops forward via air assault, you have to sustain them. And therefore you fix yourself to a predictable tempo and route of insertion for those supplies, which means that you will quickly see attrition of airframes. And so while Chinook should be used in logistical support of elements behind the lines, and while air assault in certain contexts to seize key objectives may be a tactic that can be employed, it shouldn't be the thing that aviation is built around or organized around, because it is a mission that is increasingly constrained by the threat environment. And with that, I will surrender to the chair and submit us to your questions. So thank you very much.
Brilliant, thanks, Justin and Jack. That was pretty comprehensive, you know, from the tactical and technical right the way through, and the questions have been flooding in, and they cover all of that. I'm going to brigade a few together just so we can get them through. And I guess the first one, which comes from a variety of people, is about the command and control. And I'm fascinated by this. So if they're putting a brigade structure together that's independent, that's going after the deep targets, at what level does C2 for that sit? Is it with Div? Is it with Core? Is it, you know, where does that sit in terms of our structure? And how much is that going to be sat alongside, you know, the availability of F-35 data, you know, which is going to be hugely classified and very limited, and, you know, your inability to get to it? How much are they going to be able to rely on it on the basis that their mission planning that you're talking about is utterly reliant on some of that data to plan ingress and egress routes?
So if I start with the echelons and then push to Justin on F-35, I think the realistic point is that if you just map out how far from the front line you want the supply base to be, what you're really talking about is the brigade being sat under a core support area. That's where its kind of hub will be. I know there's a lot of talk about dispersed operations and dispersed logistics, which might well be relevant for forces that are able to self-defend when they're on the ground, like armor. And conceal themselves. It might also be relevant for kind of short periods between shifting the main logistics hub for aviation. But fundamentally, you are vulnerable on the ground, and your fuel in particular is very vulnerable. And so you can't really disperse it, which means that if you want to avoid having it under indirect fire threat that's unacceptable, you're really sitting with the core. And that is also advantageous because at that depth, you can start to access the planning tools and the strategic ISTAR assets from the core headquarters more easily, which means that you have much greater situational awareness. Having said that, you also need to have a very, very good plug-in with the divisional planning cycle. And the reason for that is that you're going to basically need to refuel and rearm, or refuel at least, in the brigade support areas. That's mainly because large bodies of Apache taking off will get picked up by over-the-horizon radar. You want to create ambiguity about where you cross the flot and how you concentrate. And therefore, landing again to refuel in the brigade support areas for very short windows and then recollecting from there before you cross the flot gives you much more endurance in reach. But in order to do that, you're going to need your fuel bowsers to be traveling with the brigade support of group of those brigades. And therefore, you're going to need to coordinate your missions with the divisional headquarters as they maneuver those brigades around the battlefield. I'll hand over to Justin on F-35.
Hang on, Jack. So You're saying it needs to sit at brigade level, if not higher, correct? Sorry, the brigade needs to sit at divisional level, if not higher, in order to be deconflicted with other parts of the battle space.
Yeah, and another reason for that is that one of the real assets of something like Wildcat is that a lot of the crews are trained for applying joint effects, and similarly with Apache, which means that you could have an Apache work its way in, get PID on the target, having been led there by standoff sensors and the planning process, and then actually bring to bear not just the missiles that it has available, but give really accurate directing for fire from long-range MLRS, for example, from the core fires group. And so, yeah, plugging in at core level in warfighting and having close ties to the division is really where I see it. You could link it to the division, but it will be slightly disjointed from the division in terms of where it's geographically located, would be my concern with that. If you're talking about battle groups being deployed in somewhere like Erbil in competition, then obviously there isn't the same threat and it can deploy much more flexibly.
Okay, sorry, go ahead, Justin.
I mean, on the F-35 side of things, which we can also kind of use as a proxy in discussions for capable, penetrating, highly classified ISTAR, various kinds, some of which will come into service, particularly with the US over the next 5 to 10 years, where it isn't already. Essentially, this comes back to one of the core points of the paper, which is that for this to fulfill its potential as an extremely potent deep strike and kind of high intensity warfighting capability for the British Army, it needs to be seen not as a supporting element, but as a supported element. And so, for example, if you're looking at an asset like the F-35, which, if you look at a UK context, especially if they're doing carrier strikey things as well, is going to be very scarce in terms of usable sorties in the particular area of operations with sufficient pilot pilot workload capacity to look into these things. In its current form, what you would need to be doing is actually tasking part of those sorties to be for mapping out the sort of threat dispositions that would then be relevant to the Apache planning cycle for a particular period. So if it was possible to, for example, have a 4 ship of F-35s that are going into further into the deep to do something, to task them with recording dispositions of known, for example, surface-to-air missile emitters or notable areas of travel for ground forces that have short-range air defenses as part of the compartment, or whatever it is that you're interested in, that would be fine. You could bring that back, but it then would have to feed back into that divisional planning process and be passed to the brigade. It's not likely to be something that you can rely on as an organic, up-to-the-minute, real-time thing that you can pull down, because, of course, F-35, as with any penetrating asset, can offboard data, but it will do so through proprietary directional data links that are highly classified. And unless there is a relay asset that can not only take that MADL or whatever other type of data link it is, convert it into link 16 and then push it, or something else, and then push it to, say, Apache, maybe via Wildcat or whatever, then if Wildcat gets link, you're still having to choose what you ask for from that F-35. It's not going to be streaming everything it can see because of bandwidth limitations and MCOT limitations. So again, yeah, there's plenty of potential there, but it starts from seeing the aviation brigade as a supported element that is critical to the overall fighting power of the force, rather than a supporting bit of extra tank killing firepower, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, but and that's why, to me, this feels like a core level asset rather than a div one. I mean, if it's the deep fight, that is the core level function, and it feels to me like that's where it's going to be directed from. That it's less linked to the div, and it's one level up. I mean, Jack, is there not an argument for absolutely it being the core asset that they want to use?
Yes, I think there is, not least because the Allied Rapid Reaction Corps is considered very highly across NATO as a headquarters, but a lot of its enabling troops, including its aviation, is being pulled across to support US 5 Corps as it's being stood up. And so the credibility of ARC is therefore slightly challenged by virtue of the fact that it's losing some of its US assets. If the UK were to put in an aviation force, that would be quite comparable to what the US had and offer. And therefore, that could become something that maintains its credibility and can continue to fulfill that role within NATO. The challenge is, as I say, British line units are very, very accustomed to having Apache support them. And there is, it is still all batted under the division. And, as the maximum line of effort for the UK in terms of sovereign forces would be a division, then you start getting into questions about, well, who's controlling the assets? And so I think it would really depend as to whether 3rd Division was fighting under a US Corps or whether it was fighting under ARC, as to whether or not the Combat Aviation Brigade would be attached to the division or the relevant corps. And
I think that's the nub of quite a lot of these questions is, should it be under the ACC if it's so instrumental? Is it core? Is it a national asset? What happens to support? I mean, it doesn't really get into answering those questions, but there's a lot going on in the Q&A panel. So let me just shift target a little bit. You talked about the 72-hour planning cycle that is envisaged, that you've envisaged around this formation. Now, Alistair Campbell, Andrew Doriga, I apologize if you got the name wrong, sir, Christopher Samuel, they're all talking about this idea of, how realistic is that planning cycle in a day where we feel in contemporary conflict that operations are less predictable, that being able to plan out 72 hours is, feels like a pipe dream. It feels like some sort of pixie dust that we're spraying over. You know, everything will be fine in 72 hours, and this is what we can plan. And it doesn't feel like in contemporary conflict we can play that. And it feels like that's what a lot of the questions are aiming at. You know, how realistic is us talking about a 72-hour planning cycle? You know, what size of planning staff are you going to need to support plan multiple near simultaneous missions on that 72-hour group? Is it possible in a peer-on-peer conflict? I mean, you know, where does this come from, and how did you get to this to this decision of 72 hours?
Sure. So in terms of the exact timeline, firstly, in terms of planning multiple operations, the brigade staff have now done that on a warfighting exercise in the US where it's been simulated, and they have maintained that tempo of operations. So they've also been through a Cerberus doing it. So we do have confirmation that the brigade staff is able to handle that number of sorties and missions in a simulated environment. In terms of why 72 hours, it's not so much that you're picking the target and then assuming that everything is fixed and then working towards that. It's more that once you've identified a threat that justifies the risk of inserting the Apaches, let's say there is a large armored formation that we know is maneuvering towards the area that the target that we're advancing on. And if it gets there intact, it is going to substantially increase the combat power of the adversary force. You know, in an environment where there is a very substantial indirect fire threat, the Americans are using penetrating, assets to start conducting strikes across that area. That unit is going to be constrained in its movement, and it will move in a fairly predictable pace. You can do planning about where could it possibly go given its current location and speed of movement and the rest of it, and what we know about the formation from intelligence. But if we have identified as a target, you then also need to, as Justin said, potentially task pull data off F-35s that are doing other missions. You are wanting to pull together a deep understanding of what assets are in the operating environment that are a threat. SA-15, for example, is something that outranges Apache and is optimized to knock it down. Now, there are a limited number of SA-15s, so if you know where they are, and they do have to emit quite substantially in order to provide the point defense, then you can bypass them. And there are effective means of doing that. That is a realistic expectation. But you still need to map out where the SA-15s are in the operating environment, which means that you have a whole series of RFIs, requests for information, that feed into your planning process. Now, things are updating and things are changing in that time, but units don't disappear and reappear elsewhere, right? Once you've fixed down where a certain number of units are, there's only so far they can move, and you can start tracking those movements with something like Wildcat. Because if a F-35 tells you there is an SA-15 battery in this location, and you have your Wildcats doing persistent orbits above the brigade combat area, and they start focusing on that part of terrain, and the GMTI starts picking up that suddenly a group of armored vehicles are maneuvering in a certain direction, then you can now keep track of that, which means that you understand the updating threat environment. So the 72 hours was basically built on our analysis of the other elements of the force, their operating tempos, and the kinds of information that you're trying to pull together in order to have the relevant situational awareness and soak to make the judgment at the end of that as to whether you can effectively go in against that formation. So it's not so much fixed target, 72 hours it takes us to put it together. It's more that the other thing is that that planning process may well speed up as you go through multiple cycles, because lots of the questions that are relevant will be the same the next time round. It's just getting a update on an asset that you've already identified and are therefore tracking using lower echelon capabilities. But the reason that we're framing it that way is that if you get into the position where the divisional headquarters is tasking Apaches on missions at very short notice, this has just happened, we're surprised, we weren't looking in the deep, this unit's just showed up, attack it, then you won't have that soak in the surrounding and operating environment to be able to judge whether or not you are going to run into something that will rapidly attrit the force.
It's also, just to jump in slightly, it's worth remembering that there's a tendency to assume that two relatively contradictory trends, which are hugely important looking at future warfighting scenarios, that of increasing competition and contested EMS conditions and driving back of traditional sort of big wing I-star, making the battlefield harder to observe, at least in a target grade reliable sense, often lends us a perception that somehow we'll be always groping in the dark in a future peer conflict. But at the same time, there's also this discussion that all of these UAVs and orbital sensors and multispectral capabilities and a move to networking things up is going to make the battlefield transparent so that our assets will be unable to hide. And that doesn't work just one way for one and one way for the other. So on the one hand, yes, there is always the potential that you get a degraded sensor picture in times and you become surprised by things that you missed or that were obscured behind the fog of war, or you had just a degraded picture of things. On the other hand, when enemy EW is less effective because they can't dominate the whole spectrum all the time, or where you are able to get things in, you will have a level of granular essay about what's going on in the deep that will dwarf that available in any previous large-scale conflict. So it's important to remember it's a mix of the two. The battlefield isn't just getting more opaque for one side and more transparent for the other. It's an interesting temporally shifting mix of both. So again, as Jack said, that 72 hours planning cycle, of course, sometimes it will fall short. Of course, sometimes it will have to be sped up, or they'll have to start from scratch because something just isn't workable. But as a baseline, it makes sense based on the sort of different interactions with different echelons and different units that we figured they'd have to be doing.
Okay, so two other themes are really emerging from the questions. The first is on the sort of maritime land split. And I know this is a land paper. It's a land formation. It's capability paid for by the Army as a land formation, and there it goes. But you've talked about, for example, the sea spray radar, which is on the RN Wildcat and not the Army Wildcat. We've talked about EW capabilities, which the RN is more interested in perhaps at the moment. We've talked about, and we've just seen, the deployment of the UK Carrier Strike Group with 4 Wildcats disappearing off with a company of Royal Marines. So there is a degree to which this is going to be looked at with interest for amphibious. So whilst you said that we have this an acceptable idea of what an airborne operation might look like, do we say the same for an amphibious operation? And what caveats do we put on that in terms of the use of the aviation brigade?
So we looked at this quite a lot and spent a long time down in Yeovilton with naval personnel and looking at their simulations. And obviously they have the sea spray radar. So a lot of our research on that was working with the Royal Navy. I think what the Royal Navy has done with Wildcat in particular, in terms of not only sea spray, but also martlet and other munitions, is very, very useful and significant. The real challenge is that Apache's not wet built. It does suffer if you start putting it on ships. And therefore, if you start packaging out small numbers of Apache to continually support the commandos and flying them from ships, what you will find is that they will need to go into deep maintenance when they come back. And that will start affecting readiness across the force, because we only have 50 Apaches. And so really we can generate 2 battle groups and have a couple left over for training and as a reserve. So it can be done, but it comes at a very, very substantial cost in terms of the readiness of the battle group as a formation. And I suppose that the question there is, if you start accepting that you're going to parcel them out in small numbers, then and therefore lose the ability to deploy the large formation, then you're not really bringing the capability to bear, and it's not going to be ready when you necessarily need it. So I think what we will likely see is, on the one hand, what the Royal Navy has done with Wildcat is something that the Army should definitely be, working with them on and cooperating on and learning from. And similarly, what they've done in some ways buys out some of the dependency upon Apache, because they've massively increased the firepower of their littoral forces. But I think we need to get into a space where we are more thinking about the commando force enabling theatre access, and then the brigade deploying and operating from land, rather than parceling out units to operate from the sea. Because otherwise what you will do is you will perpetuate what is the current situation, where we have these aviation assets triple-hatted or quadruple-hatted across missions. And when you start looking at the risk that's involved in that, it's not possible for them to meet all of those expectations. And when we're talking about integration with core and with NATO forces, the exercise tempo also means that pulling battle groups off or parts of battle groups off to kind of be on ship starts really eating into that exercise opportunity as well. So I think we're probably going to see the Royal Marines be more dependent on their organic wildcat capability for that firepower. But I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing. I think it means that we just need to be more honest and clear from a policy point of view about when we're committing assets and making sure that we're not committing them to multiple places at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, we could have a discussion about British policy honesty in committing lots of things to lots of different commitments. But Justin, listen, there's a question about the GMTI and the Wildcat pairing with Apache. Do you want to answer that question about the GMTI soak?
Yeah, I mean, I think the interesting thing is that at the moment, the Wildcat Apache pairing that we were lucky enough to see demonstrated, with the Apache and Wildcat operating together, attempting to infiltrate forward, use the sensible and the communications links on the Wildcat, which of course in many ways are significantly superior to, particularly in navigational terms, to the older D model Apaches. That actually is not necessarily, I think, the model that will work best if you're looking at a peer conflict and where if they're being used as a penetrating kind of strategic asset for these sort of deep strikes against high value enemy targets. Partly because a Wildcat suffers slightly without extra fuel tanks. It's shorter range than Apache. It also doesn't have the same level of situational awareness, particularly without the sea spray radar. And it doesn't have Link 16 yet. It really ought to. It's just not necessarily as well suited. And the E model Apache, which is now coming in, actually fixes a lot of those deficiencies in terms of things like modern moving maps, updated defensive software, new upgraded ability to do defensive aid subsystem, threat recognition and decoys with a directed infrared countermeasure system, all of this kind of good stuff. In some ways, the Apache becomes, and also incidentally, an upgraded EOIR sensible. So it sort of reverses the position where currently Wildcat has the slightly better optical and infrared sensors and better navigational aids, to a point where Wildcat is probably better suited to doing that standoff GMTI soak, exactly as stated. But to do that, it really does require the sea spray radar that the maritime version has, and also Link 16, so it can pass things around better. With that, you can probably see a more productive potential pairing where the Wildcat is operating a little bit behind the front lines, using that GMTI capability to kind of build up situational awareness, and if necessary, pass data forward to the Apaches, which are going forward themselves, rather than kind of this close teaming that we see now.
Okay, the final question, and there's lots, we're not going to answer the other 22 questions that are out there, right? And I should reassure people who've been asking questions that lots of this is in the paper itself, which you can download on the RUSI website and get into, and please do, because a lot of the detail you've been asking about is there. But Sarah Passon asked the question that sits at the base of this, which lots of people who've had experience in Afghanistan and Iraq would want to know. Ground troops are used to having close air on support. It's on call, whether that's aviation or fast air. It feels like from the integrated operating concept, the Defence Command Plan, the IR, that fast air is not going to be available to troops. Okay, that's going to be doing its own thing. It's going to be now we're taking aviation away as well and saying that they're going to be doing deep strike. What is going to be providing support to troops? Because at the moment, if we're relying on 155 and 105s, I mean, there isn't much there that is going to be providing support to troops in contact. What is the solution where we having taken away this from the fight on the ground?
So yeah, this is a very substantial problem, and it's a problem facing the force faces. And I would argue Apache has been being used as an unrealistic crutch to get us out of that problem, because the way that I expect it would have unfolded if we were using Apache in that close support role, is that, you know, Fast Air is going to be dedicated to trying to win access to the air environment by doing SIAD-DIAD. That will take a number of weeks, and therefore, you know, they won't be doing CAS for that period. Apache, if it was providing CAS, would get you out of the hole that you're in over the next 12 hours while it's present, has munitions, and hasn't been shot down yet, and is able to kind of knock out that first echelon of enemy armor. But because it's having to loiter in orbits above the units that it's protecting, because it is right at the front edge with everything pointed at it, it will invariably be attrited. And then the British unit, because we are numerically inferior to most of the units that we would be up against, will be rolled by the next group that comes through. And so the deep strike capability is absolutely fundamental to stopping you being rolled by what comes next, because all of a sudden the close fight becomes rather anticlimactic in the sense that enemy forces are already attrited. They've lost a lot of their best capabilities, and they are much weaker when you actually come into contact with them. So the deep strike is really critical to the close fight, and it enables victory in the close or success in the close. But the second component is, yeah, we are very, very deficient in firepower. You know, Warrior, when it was being upgraded, still didn't have an anti-tank guided weapon. Boxer, as we'll see where they get to in the summer in terms of modules, but as previously envisaged, we were still relying on dismounted Javelin. And we have a very, very small number of Spike NLOS, so which, you know, needs to be replaced. The IR confirms that it will be replaced. The details of what that is and how many hasn't really been set out. So I think really this is just highlighting what was already a very, very substantial deficiency in our close combat forces, which is anti-tank firepower. And if this leads us to realize that that is a deficiency that we can't afford, then that is a good thing. And if we're not prepared to fill that gap, then, you know, that's not an argument for pushing Apache back into the hole, because it's putting a square peg in a round hole.
Jack, thank you very much indeed. Go on, Justin.
I was
Final
just
words.
going to add one last thing to add is it's not just, we talk about tanks, but of course in a NATO context, it's not just the main battle tanks. Ironically enough, if you look at the Javelin posts that the British Army, you know, maneuver elements are supposed to have, you can make an argument that they're nearly adequate for the level of main battle tanks that you might see in equivalent Russian formations. What they completely aren't adequate for is stopping the remainder of the armored fighting vehicles and infantry fighting vehicles, so armored personnel carriers and infantry fighting vehicles, which are also spectacularly lethal and quite armored. So it's not either just a case of saying you just have to buy way more anti-tank, specifically dedicated anti-tank. One route that the army could go would be pursuing a much larger number of its vehicles with modules that have a gun sufficient to take out everything that is armored short of a main battle tank, which would then give you a lot more effective capacity with the Javelin posts or follow-on Javelin equivalent that you do have to concentrate on the tanks themselves.
Thanks, Justin, and to both our speakers. I can only apologise to all those who ask questions. It's my failure to package them up and get to the speakers in time, and not theirs for answering what I did ask. Listen, we hope you enjoyed the event today. You can hear more from Jack and Justin in their commentaries. You can read those online, but also at the conferences we've got coming up, whether with UK Strategic Command, our Missile Defence Conference on Precision Strike, or the flagship RUSI Land Warfare Conference. Details are on the RUSI website. To our members, particularly, thank you for joining us. You can enjoy an exclusive event tomorrow that will expose North Korea's breaking of the UN-mandated cap on petroleum exports. On the 11th of May, you can have an exclusive audience with Lord Peter Ricketts about how the UK needs to rethink its role in the global international order. If you enjoyed the event and you're not a member, you might consider looking into that. Now we are deep in the springtime in the Northern Hemisphere, you might want to consider freshening up your thinking and revisiting some of those key concepts that form the basis of our presumptions and assumptions about defence and security, from basic principles to the most complex and challenging questions. RUSI membership can help in all that. Why not exercise your mind and sate your intellectual curiosity by becoming a member of this august institute? For less than £10 a month, you can get access to some of the most insightful and influential research on defence and security. And that's according to Prospect magazine, who recently voted RUSI as their think tank of the year. Details are at rusi.org/membership. Thanks for joining us. We hope to see you again soon.